Johnny Talk Sports here at the Week 5 college football predictions. Last week I went 7-4. Not bad, but wish I could have done a little bit better with my picks. Sometimes it happens when you try to predict so many upsets in one week. But overall, after 4 weeks of the season, I am sitting with a correct pick percentage of 69%, which is pretty excellent for where I want to be. I kind of want to be around the 70-71% mark by the end of the year. And so far, pretty good pace. Just got to pick some correct games throughout the next couple weeks to kind of get into a comfort zone in my picks. So, 10 more games to predict today, and the 11th one, Ohio State, Nebraska, will be within the next day or two. But 10 more games to predict today. But before I get to that, I did want to give out my top 10. So this is my personal top 10. I'm going to plan on doing this every single week for the rest of the season because once we get to that college football playoff ranking, it's going to be after all the games are completed on Saturday, then I'll make my own top 10. But here's my top 10 for this week. I'm going to start doing this after the games are done on Saturday because I was going to do this current top 10 on Saturday, but UCLA and Washington State, that turned out to be the game of the year probably, and the best game I've probably seen, at least a regular season wise. As far as maybe greatest regular season games of all time, it's probably top 3 or top 4. So here's my top 10. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, so I'm not going to go too in depth on it because I really want to get to my picks. So at number 1, I have, of course, Clemson. And Clemson, they have made some mistakes throughout the season. Like, they're not playing as perfect as everyone expects them to. Trevor Lawrence is making some mistakes, but I think the further on the season goes, the better Clemson is going to be. Number 2 is Alabama, and Alabama is number 2 because they're just dominating everybody that they play. Number 3, I have LSU, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a controversial decision by me. But I think LSU is number 3 over Georgia, who I have at number 4. Because both of these teams, they have a strong win on their resumes already. LSU's beaten Texas, and Georgia's beaten Notre Dame. The biggest difference for that is LSU's victories on the road, while Georgia's was in Athens. So I am giving LSU a bigger boost in their resume because they have a convincing road win against Texas on their resume. Number 5, I have Auburn. And Auburn, they have 2 great wins on their resume. They've got a road win against Texas A&M, and they have a win against Oregon on a neutral field. But Auburn is going to be tested pretty soon in this season. They've got big matchups coming up in the later portion of the season. So it's going to be interesting to see how good this Auburn team, led by freshman quarterback Bo Nix, how good they really are as we get deeper into SEC conference play. Number 6, I have Ohio State. And Ohio State, they haven't played as much competitive teams. In fact, Ohio State really hasn't played any competitive teams at all yet. But they'll get to play a competitive team this week in Nebraska on the road. So this will be a huge game for Ohio State, a huge road test for them, especially in prime time on the road in Memorial Stadium, sold-out crowd. Number 7, I have the Oklahoma Sooners, and Oklahoma is led by, right now, the Heisman frontrunner Jalen Hurts, and Oklahoma, they haven't really played anybody that good yet this season either. Their only 2 wins against Power 5 teams are, just any teams in general that aren't FCS, are Houston, who's a group of 5 team that blew a lead against Tulane this past week, and UCLA. So Oklahoma also, it's going to be a tough road for them. But if Oklahoma wins out and they run the table, they will be one of the 4 in the playoff. Number 8, I have the Wisconsin Badgers. And I was debating whether or not to put Wisconsin at number 7. Because I think Wisconsin, their win against Michigan, it was very convincing. So I was thinking about putting Wisconsin at 7, maybe even 6 ahead of Ohio State. But I think Wisconsin leapfrogging Ohio State in my rankings was a little bit too much. But Wisconsin, they're definitely a top 7 or 8 team in college football right now. Number 9, I have Texas. Texas, they were challenged by Oklahoma State this past weekend, but they fended off the comeback against the Cowboys. So Texas, they are in the 9th ranked position in my rankings. And rounding out my top 10 is the Florida Gators. Now, I wasn't sure whether or not to put the Florida Gators at 10 or the Oregon Ducks at 10, because at 11, I have Oregon. Number 12, I have Notre Dame. Because I ultimately decided to put Florida at number 10 instead of Oregon is because I'm giving Florida the benefit of being undefeated right now. Florida, they haven't really been as dominant as everyone has thought that they had the potential to be. Because Florida had a tight game against Miami, a tight game against Kentucky. So Florida, I think, is good at the 10th spot right now in my rankings. So now on to my Week 5 college football picks. And we open up with 2 Friday night games. The first one, number 12 Penn State travels to Maryland to take on the Terrapins. Now, instantly what jumps out to me, but what may end up being misleading, is the scoring offenses. Both these teams are in the top 10 in the FBS in scoring offense. Penn State is 9th with 47 points per game on average, and Maryland is 4th in the FBS with 53 points per game. So I think this number is a little bit misleading. I'm predicting a much low scoring game. I'll be surprised if this game ends up being high scoring. But Penn State, this could be a trap game for the Nittany Lions, although a huge key for them is they are the least penalized team in the Power 5 after 4 weeks in the season. I did think at first that Penn State was going to not be that good as the season went down the road after their close encounter with Pitt, but then Pitt ended up beating UCF. So now I think Penn State's narrow victory against Pittsburgh isn't as bad at this point than what I thought originally. But anyway, back to Penn State being the least penalized team in the Power 5. That's going to be huge for them. It's going to be important they don't get penalized setting up long yardage situations, especially with Maryland's home crowd getting into it. But both these teams, they are in the top 15 in scoring defense. Penn State's 4th in scoring defense, only giving up 10 points per game, and Maryland's 14th in scoring defense, only giving up an average of 13.3 points per game. So I think this game is going to be very low scoring. But in the end, I think the Nittany Lions, I think they come out of this road test with a win. I think Penn State gets a narrow margin of victory. I think it's going to be 27-23. I think the Nittany Lions get a very close victory. But sometimes in college football, it's just survive and advance. Next, we have an interesting Pac-12 matchup that doesn't really have much hype as it would have if Arizona State would have beaten Colorado. So, the California Golden Bears, they are the surprise team in college football so far. Being ranked 15th in the country, although the one downside to their undefeated season so far is that all of their games have been decided by one score. So that is going to be, I'm not really buying that Cal is going to blow out Arizona State, but at least the Golden Bears know how to handle one-score games. And so far they've pulling off an upset against Washington on the road, and they have a huge SEC road win against Ole Miss. Even though it's just Ole Miss, winning a road game in the SEC conference, it's pretty difficult against SEC opponents. Both these teams are pretty good with scoring defense, so I think this won't be a high-scoring game, unlike most Pac-12 games. Because Arizona State's only giving up less than 14 points per game, and Cal's only giving up 17 points a game. So I think the California Golden Bears are going to win this matchup. I think in a highly defensive battle, I think the Golden Bears win by a score of 20-15. I think it's going to be that low scoring of a game, which feels pretty low for a Pac-12 game. So next we're moving on to Northwestern and number 8 Wisconsin. And Wisconsin will be missing starting safeties Eric Burrell and Reggie Pearson in the first half for both committing targeting penalties against Michigan last week. They'll be out for the first half. However, the Badgers, they still have a dominant running game. They're averaging 264 yards per game, which is second in the Big Ten and 12th in the FBS. And Wisconsin is leading the nation in quite a bit of categories. They're first in scoring defense, and they're first in total defense, and they're also first in the nation in time of possession. And that's a huge reason why that they have this dominant running game. It's because they are a run-first offense, and they exhaust defenses. And I would say for Northwestern to stay in this game, I would say to try to throw the ball with missing those safeties in the first half of the Badgers. But Northwestern is 123rd in the nation in passing offense. And Northwestern is also 128th in the FBS in scoring offense. So I think this is going to be a long afternoon for the Wildcats. I think the Badgers, despite missing those key pieces in the secondary for one half, I think the Badgers will dominate this game because they'll assert their running game, which is arguably the best in college football, being led by Heisman contender Jonathan Taylor. So I think the Badgers win this by at least 24 points. I think it's going to be a score of 45-10. I think Northwestern will be able to muster some points on the board, but that's about it. Now we have number 1 Clemson taking on the North Carolina Tar Heels. And the Tar Heels, after a 2-0 start in come-from-behind victories against South Carolina and Miami, North Carolina has lost 2 straight games. 2 heartbreaking losses in a row to Wake Forest, where they tried to come back again for a 3rd consecutive week, but came up just short. And last week against Appalachian State, another heartbreaking loss. So now it's just going to get worse for North Carolina. And the last thing that you want when you're going through 2 heartbreaking losses in a row is to have the number 1 team in the country come into your town. And that's exactly what's happening with North Carolina. Despite Clemson not being as consistent and not being close to perfection as we're expecting, I think Clemson has no problems in this matchup. I think Clemson wins by at least 31 points. I think it's going to be that big of a victory for the Clemson Tigers, as I think Clemson is just going to get better the further on the season goes. Next we have Ole Miss versus number 2 Alabama. Ole Miss went through a heartbreaking loss, which possibly they should have had that touchdown on the second to last play of the game, because the receiver's feet were in the end zone, but that play was not reviewed. And now they have to go on the road in Tuscaloosa to take on the Crimson Tide. And Alabama is just dominating whoever they play. Alabama, they haven't played any strong opponents yet, but Alabama will at some point. They're going to play LSU, whose passing offense is just miraculously improved over the last decade. They're going to play Auburn, who could end up possibly being a contender at this point for the college football playoff. Possibly Georgia in the SEC championship game. So Alabama will play the tough opponents soon. But right now, they have Ole Miss to deal with. And I see no problem for the Crimson Tide. I think they're going to move the ball at will. Tua Tagovailoa is going to have another 5-6 touchdown passes in this game, and they're going to talk about him being the number 1 overall pick of the Dolphins, and that's just going to be it. I think Alabama wins 52-7. I think Ole Miss will score once, and that'll be it. All right, so next we have the number 18th ranked Virginia Cavaliers versus the number 10 Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Now, Virginia, they were in a battle with Old Dominion last week. Old Dominion also did beat Virginia Tech last year. So, Virginia struggled a bit with Old Dominion. And Notre Dame, a heartbreaking loss last week against Georgia on the road. However, it could be a morale victory because if the Irish win out, they may have an argument for being one of the 4 teams in the playoff, especially with teams ahead of them bound to lose. So Notre Dame, they now know that they have to win out to keep their college football playoff hopes alive. If Notre Dame loses one more time this season, that's it. And how the Irish are going to win each and every single game, they're going to have to bring their A game, just like any other team. But Notre Dame's margin for error is a lot smaller than, let's just say, Clemson's or Alabama's or Ohio State's or Oklahoma's. Their margin for error is really small. Now, one thing that's going to stick out to me, and I think what's going to decide the game, is can Notre Dame's offensive line protect Ian Book? Because Virginia is leading the nation in total sacks with 20 over the first 4 weeks of the season. Virginia is also 14 in total defense. So if Notre Dame's offensive line can give Ian Book time to make some plays, I think Notre Dame will win this game. And I'm going to pick the Irish to win this game, but in a low-scoring game. I think, not low-scoring game, but a close game. I think Virginia's going to stay in it from start to finish, but I think Notre Dame, I think they escape with the win here. I think it's going to be 31-27. Like I said earlier, sometimes in college football, it's just about survive and advance. Next, we have the number 21 ranked USC Trojans taking on the number 17 Washington Huskies. And what an interesting matchup we have here. USC quarterback Keaton Sloven is in the concussion protocol at this point. So USC is not rushing his return. While when we look at Washington, they're still 17th in the country. Their one loss this season so far is to the 15th ranked California Golden Bears. So how bad is this loss really for the Huskies? So this is ultimately an elimination game for a spot in the college football playoff. And yes, the Pac-12's playoff hopes are just as much alive as any one-loss team in any conference. So I don't want to hear this Pac-12 is eliminated from the playoff talk because it's complete nonsense. Any Pac-12 team with one loss may end up making the playoff against a one-loss Notre Dame team if it came down to it. But here's what I think is going to be the game within the game. It's going to be a war between the USC wide receivers and the Washington secondary. That's where the game is going to be won and lost. Matt Fink had 351 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick last week in the upset victory against Utah. They are coming off an emotional win against the 10th ranked at the time the 10th ranked Utah Utes. And Washington's secondary, their pass defense, they're allowing over 10 yards per catch and 213 passing yards a game. So I think if Matt Fink has a repeat performance of last week, USC is going to come out big in this game. But I'm going to pick USC to win a shootout, I think it's going to be. I think USC picks up a 38-35 win over the Huskies. Moving on to Mississippi State and number 8 Auburn. Auburn, they have 2 good wins already on their resume for the College Football Playoff Committee. And Auburn, I think, like I said at the beginning, they're going to be challenged in the second half of the season. But is Mississippi State going to be a challenge for them? I think with them being at Jordan-Hare, despite having a running back to go against like Kylan Hill, I think Auburn's running game is going to be the difference as well. Right now, a good running game for Auburn is very helpful for a freshman quarterback, and that's how Auburn's winning games. I think it's going to continue for right now. I like Auburn to win this by at least 13 points in Jordan-Hare. Moving on to number 24 Kansas State and Oklahoma State. And I think this is going to be an underrated matchup of the week. This is one of the best ones. Oklahoma State is coming off a 6-point loss against the Texas Longhorns. And they challenged Texas. They made them earn it. And Kansas State, they're coming off a bye week, so they've had an extra week of rest and an extra week to prepare for this game in Stillwater. So Kansas State, they are not a very much penalized team. And Kansas State also has a great running offense. On the other side, however, Chuba Hubbard for Oklahoma State is leading the nation in rushing yards. So I think this is going to be a game of which running game can keep their offense on the field. I think this is going to be a game of chicken. It's going to be which team can hold the ball the longest and win the time of possession and keep the other offense off the field. I think that's going to go to Kansas State. I like Kansas State's running game to get yards in chunks. Maybe not big chunks, but just enough chunks to keep Oklahoma State's offense on the sidelines. I'm taking the Wildcats to win this game by a touchdown. I'm going to say 45-37. And finally, the final game this week is Washington State versus number 19 Utah. So Washington State, they had a 33-point lead. I think it was 32-33, whatever. They had a 30-plus point lead last week against UCLA in the third quarter. And they managed to blow that lead. So how does Washington State respond this week? They're going up against Utah. Now, this is going to be the toughest opponent Washington State has faced so far this year. Anthony Gordon is throwing for 400 yards in every single contest, but he's yet to face a pass defense or defense in general like Utah's. And this is a road game. So really the first road game for Anthony Gordon in this air raid offense. So I think both these teams are coming off losses last week. But I think Utah is going to respond. If Utah can hold Anthony Gordon to less than 300 passing yards, I think Utah is going to win this one. For Washington State to win, they have to get Max Borghi going in the running game. Because we haven't seen that much out of Max Borghi so far this season in the running game. And I think we're going to have to see some of Max Borghi if Washington's going to win. Utah, they are facing the air raid offense for the second consecutive week. And I think now that they have some experience with it so far this season, going up against the Trojans, I think they're going to play much better this week. And I think the Utes, I think they pick up I think they're going to win by at least 13. I'm not sold on Washington State's defense. I think Utah wins. I think it's going to be 41-28. So those are my Week 5 college football predictions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.